Chimera is delighted to bring you some of Scotland's most exciting new voices in our Brave New Words readings. M.E Rodman writes LGBT plus fantasy with a dark edge and occasional stories of horror and the uncanny. Their short fiction has appeared in numerous anthologies, and their debut novel, Blood and Thorn, was published by Grimbold Books in 2020. Their Brave New Words reading is from their novella, Clockwork Sister, published with Luna Press Publishing earlier this year.
The black lacquerwood coffin of Mara A. Tam, 8th princess of the Tamian dynasty, rumbled slowly along the heart vein of the city towards the distant spirals of the imperial tombs. Behind it, the many leaves of the Empress's Bridge folded back against each other with well-oiled precision, separating the island of the imperial palace from Tam City once again. The heart vein was lined with citizens, each one standing with their heads bowed. Silence shrouded the path, broken only by the hollow thud of the funeral drum as it beat out its rhythm. Black streamers whirled in gusting winds from the open windows. Swathes of black cloth covered the doors of houses and shops that ran along the vein, the colour of mourning scattered through the capital. Mourning for a woman no one in the city had ever seen. Ayan's hands clenched briefly inside the pockets of her coat. The master of ceremonies had placed her directly behind the cart, close enough to touch the coffin's slick, polished surface. She walked at the head of 500 imperial courtiers and did not look back. The courtiers were silent too, affording the princess more respect in death than they ever had in life. And suppose she should have been bitter about that. But all she felt was numb. Nothing seemed real. Not the coffin, not the drum, not the ground beneath her feet, not the crowds that watched in silence. The sky above was heavy with cloud, a promise of rain in a wind that was damp and cold and blew along the broad passage of the heart vein with enough force to tug at the elaborate headdresses and black mourning streamers that adorned the procession. The elaborate arches of the bone bridge reared up ahead, pale against the shadowed sky. The parapet was lined by bridge guards in black and red livery, iron-tipped spears in their hands. They stood straight, heads up, in proud salute to the cavalcade's approach. The bone bridge was the longest of the Maker's bridges, stretching out over a mile of northern ocean before it reached the islands of the dead. A scattering of rain swept through the crowd, and Ayan shivered despite her thick wool coat. The coffin in its creaking, straining cart rumbled across the bridge and into the imperial necropolis to the thud of the drum. The great tombs of the imperial family, with their golden spires and bright red-tiled roofs, stood alone on the crest of the hill, a city in miniature. A long winding path crept up the steep incline in a lazy spiral that set the cart driver swearing and the courtiers panting as the cavalcade picked up its pace, nearing its destination. The paths and gardens that surrounded the tombs were immaculate, perfectly groomed by imperial gardeners. The clearings between tombs were scattered here and there by delicate wooden structures, sides open to the elements, intricately carved and fragile as spun glass. Spaces for members of the imperial family and their guests to rest in when they visited. The princess's tomb waited in the sunward side of the necropolis. It was smaller than that of her mother and aunt, sheltered behind the bulk of her elder sisters as befitted a princess who would never become a mother. Lamplight glowed in its windows and its great double doors stood waiting. Beyond them, the vast stone slab where her tomb would rest gleamed in the golden glow, marble inlaid with veins of gold. Ayan blinked. There was rain on her face, damp on cheeks and eyes. The cart rumbled in through the doors and out of sight, the doors closing behind it. Inside, servants would be frantically lifting the coffin, carefully setting it on its bier and hurriedly wiping fingerprints and rain from its pristine surface. Outside, the court waited, silent in respect, the wind whistling past the leaning bodies of encircling tombs. Those closest to Ayan shivered, though she could not help but notice the space that existed around her. When the door swung open again, the coffin was in its place, and the Empress herself was standing beside it. 8 imperial princesses and 1 prince flanked their mother. Representatives of Mara's immediate family, clad entirely in black, their eyes heavily cold, streaks of black on cheeks and chin. The court went to its knees on the flags of the square before the tomb, heads bowed in respect and adoration. Ayan knelt expressionless, conscious that the only mark of mourning she'd chosen were the ribbons braided into her long dark hair. She kept her hood up and her head bowed, shrinking back from the weight of the Empress's cool, dark gaze, aware that when the Empress looked at her, she saw her dead daughter's face. The Empress stepped forward, raising her hands and opening her mouth. Her voice spun out into the rising wind. Ayan did not hear the words. They were drowned by air and numbness. She saw the courtiers around her rise and followed, standing unwavering even though her legs had begun to tremble ever so slightly. The formal words of dedication to the Dark Mother were over far too quickly. The Empress lifted her hand and the great doors of the princess's tomb closed for the last time. As one and in silence, the court turned to follow the imperial family on the long walk back down the hill. Aen stayed behind, watching the winding line with its shades of black as it moved off towards the bridge. A chill wind whipped in from the sea, leaving salt on Aen's lips. She wiped them with trembling fingers. There was a side entrance to the tomb, a narrow door painted the same grey as the building. Aen slipped inside it, her feet echoing on the chill tiles of the polished floor. The tomb was empty, the lamps no longer lit, but the windows were unshuttered, and the pale gleam of fading daylight fell into the tiled emptiness. There was nothing in the room but the bier and its lacquered burden. The princess's coffin was cold to the touch. The wood did not even feel like wood, but ran like silk beneath Aen's fingers. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice echoing in the great vault of the room, dancing back to her on the stale wind. "I'm sorry, I couldn't save you." She could almost imagine Mara's reply, the breadth of her smile, the way her eyes glowed with warmth. "No one could save me from this," she would have said. "No one." It was the truth, and it still hurt. Aen walked slowly back across the bridge, leaving the dead behind her.